the emperor came to see this horrid sight and said to us as he went over it, "It were well if all promoters of wars could behold such an appalling picture. They would then discover how many evils humanity has to suffer from their projects." Coneheart had with him a regiment of light infantry composed of Corsicans, which was at the head of the columns during his attack. The emperor passed close by and addressed them in Italian in order to discover if their spirits were not broken down by the recent loss. "We have men enough left for 2 such attacks," was the reply of one of the soldiers to his question. He then spoke some obliging words to General Cohorn on the feat of gallantry he had displayed, but pointed out to him that if he had not suffered himself to be hurried along by his courage, but had waited for the troops that were coming up previously to making the attack, this heavy loss would have been spared. Nevertheless, Cohorn ever after obtained with him the credit of being a man of undaunted bravery. The army immediately resumed its march and arrived at Ems at an early hour. This town is on the left bank of the river of the same name, is yet strongly fortified, and has a wooden bridge to which General Hiller had also set fire. We were detained there 2 days for the purpose of repairing it and throwing a bridge of boats across after passing the Salsa at Burghausen, where the bridge upon piles was made use of. The Austrian pontoons, which had served for the construction of the bridge of boats, were replaced on the carts, and by their means a bridge was thrown over the Ems, with the addition of a few boats which were on the banks of the Danube, near the mouth of the Ems, which is less than a league's distance from it. The army was thus made to pass upon 2 bridges at the same moment, and the lost time was recovered, which the reconstruction of so many bridges had necessarily taken from the march. On leaving Ems, a small town 5 leagues distant from Linz, the emperor proceeded to Milk without stopping. He took up his quarters at the house attached to the abbey and remained there a whole day for the twofold purpose of allowing the troops to come up and of enabling those to gain ground which had already passed that town. From Melk he went to St. Polten, where he learned that the corps of General Hiller had, for the most part at least, taken the road to Krems. He stopped at St. Polten to see the result of that movement, and if it was not connected with the arrival of the Archduke Charles' army, though he could hardly suppose it to have reached so far, since it had a longer march to perform and very bad roads to pass through. The emperor selected me to watch the movement upon Krems. He sent me on from St. Polten with a brigade of cuirassiers, a company of horse artillery, and a regiment of infantry. I went to take post at Mautern, where I learned that the troops of General Hiller had actually crossed the Danube on the preceding day by means of a new bridge, which had been built since the last war. Great, however, was my astonishment at finding that General Hiller had not set fire to it, but merely removed the broad planks of 2 arches on our side. The beams had even been left, so that 2 hours' labor would have sufficed for a company of workmen to repair the bridge, which they might have done with greater facility, as from the nature of the ground, a firing kept up on the left bank would have protected it from the firing to the opposite one. The people of the spot at which I had stationed myself and who had got to Krems on the opposite bank on the preceding day brought me word that Archduke Charles was expected there in a few days, and I had no doubt that the bridge of Krems had only been preserved to facilitate his crossing the river on his arrival, thereby afford him the means of covering Vienna. I sent one of my aides de camp to report this news to the emperor, who was still at St. Polten. He sent that officer back immediately to me with orders to burn the bridge and join him at Vienna. I directed a few cannon shot to be fired at the posts on the opposite side and put my troops under arms. The enemy thought I was going to attempt the passage, and they themselves set fire to the bridge, which was so completely consumed in a few hours that not a trace of it was left. They had probably foreseen this contingency and made arrangements beforehand for destroying the bridge. When this operation was over, I again set my troops in motion for Vienna, where I arrived the next day. Chapter 8. The emperor now occupied for a second time the palace of Schönbrunn, where his headquarters had been established in 1805. He had caused the suburbs to be occupied, but the city had closed its gates, and a few shot had even been fired from the ramparts. The Archduke Maximilian had shut himself up in Vienna, but it contained no other troops than a few depots and the townspeople, amongst whom the muskets found in the arsenal had been distributed. Vienna is enclosed by a strong wall of irregular and modern construction, by ditches of great depth, and by a covered way, but it is without any advanced works. It has very open glacis, and the suburbs are built at the distance required by military regulations. The suburbs are very extensive, and since the invasion of the Turks, they have been surrounded by an entrenchment covered over with masonry work, thereby forming a vast entrenched camp, closed by strong gates and proof against any attempt to scale it. The Emperor saw that if Vienna did not surrender in a few days, the Archduke Charles would arrive, and that nothing would prevent his introducing his army into that spacious extent of suburbs, from whence it would debouch upon us from several points at the same time, and place us in a situation the more perilous. As the Emperor had relied upon the resources he expected to find in Vienna, and of which he intended to avail himself to increase his means of subsistence, he made the round of that immense enclosure, and before returning to his palace, ordered the General of Artillery, Angiossi, who was in attendance and who had formerly been our ambassador at Vienna, to bring together that night all the howitzers that were with the army and place them in the most judicious manner, in order to open at 10 o'clock at night a bombarding fire, which was to be kept up until the city should demand a parley. He sent at the same time to summon the Archduke to surrender the city. The reply of that prince was unsatisfactory. General Angiossi carried into effect the orders he had received and collected, to the best of my memory, 32 howitzers, which were stationed on a spot reconnoitered beforehand, and where from the very short distance the howitzers might range along the greatest width of that city. Independently of this arrangement, the Emperor went in person with one of the divisions belonging to Massena's corps to effect at the extremity of the public walk of the Prater the passage of the arm of the Danube, which separates this island from the main island. The spot was defended by some troops of the militia who were kept off with cannon shot, and by means of boats brought over to us by people who swam to the opposite bank. The troops first passed over in a bridge was then constructed. From this moment, we were at liberty to set fire to the great bridge, named the Bridge of the Tabor, because nothing could obstruct our reaching it. The Emperor ordered General Boudet's division to cross over the island of the Prater, and he was returning in the nighttime to his headquarters at Schönbrunn. When passing abreast of the suburbs of Vienna, we saw the first discharge from the howitzers, which had the appearance of a cluster fire. There were always 10 or 12 shells in the air, and the fire accordingly broke out almost instantaneously in several places. The circumstances, added to the occupation of the island of the Prater, having no doubt proved to the hostile generals that the army of the Archduke Charles would arrive to no purpose, that it would find the Tabor Bridge destroyed, and that it was therefore useless to expose Vienna to a general conflagration. They determined to enter into a parley. They ordered their few remaining troops to cross Danube during the night. The Archduke Maximilian left his powers behind as a sanction for the capitulation of the city and followed the troops to the left bank of the Danube, causing the bridge on the Tabor to be burned as soon as he had effected his passage. Vienna surrendered the next day without any other terms than such are usually agreed upon in respect of fortified towns. And on the 12th of May, a month after the Emperor's departure from Paris, our troops took possession of it. We found in Vienna resources of every kind. In a word, we became masters of the capital, which we might consider as much at our disposal as Paris itself. We had occupied it but a few days when we learned the arrival of the Archduke Charles's army on the opposite bank of the Danube. It was much more numerous than our own, and might have greatly annoyed us if it had immediately attempted to cross the river. This was the only means of compelling us at once to evacuate Vienna, and was, I think, the Emperor's chief motive for accelerating his passage across the Danube in order to confine the Archduke Charles to an attitude of defense. Censurers have dwelt much on so important an operation having been undertaken with such inadequate means, but they have overlooked the weighty reasons which determine the emperor's judgment. It may here be said with justice that nothing is more easy than criticism, nothing more difficult than the science of war. The emperor, in fact, could not command 1/3 of the means which were absolutely requisite for crossing the Danube, whether in respect to boats, cordages, or other necessary apparatus. As soon as the war was found to be unavoidable, he had instructed the minister of Marine to send him some sailors of the flotilla, but our march had been so rapid that they were unable to come up in time. The emperor had in his service some officers of artillery and engineers of such indefatigable disposition and of so inventive a genius. And he had only to state his determination to effect the operation. They found the means of accomplishing it. It may be proper to mention in this place that if the Russian army had made a diversion in our favor, we should not have been obliged to cross the Danube. True it is, that army was not ready. But why was it not so? It had not a greater distance to march than our troops, some of which had been brought from Burgos. An officer of the Emperor of Russia arrived every week at our headquarters. A very active intercourse of letters was kept up between Russia and us. The only intercourse we wanted was that of some battalions, but we were without them, and we were therefore compelled to rely upon our own resources. The position of the army extended from the environs of St. Polten to the front of Pressburg. The emperor had been under the necessity of sending a small corps of observation to the valley of Neustadt in order to defend the defile leading into Italy. The population exhibited a greater disposition to resist us and more animosity than in the last war. This was therefore an additional difficulty for the army to contend with, which might have been very serious had we met with any severe check. The Austrian army of Galicia had just entered the Duchy of Warsaw and penetrated to the capital, which the gallant little army of Poles had been compelled to evacuate by crossing over to the right bank of the Vistula in the hope of being soon joined by the Russian army. The Austrian army had come by the left bank. Prince Poniatowski, who commanded the Poles, displayed great gallantry and talent in this campaign. The emperor, although in possession of Vienna, was surrounded with numberless difficulties. He had, besides, the Austrian army of Italy to fear, which might do him incalculable injury in its retreat before the viceroy's army could join him. Matters would have been much worse had the Archduke Charles' army crossed the Danube. All these considerations made it imperative for the emperor to cross the river. On this occasion, again, he showed a remarkable example of personal courage, for no one augured well of this operation, which appeared undertaken without proper precautions, although it was not openly objected to on account of the emperor, whose decisions none dared to combat. At last, on the night of the 19th May, he ordered down from Vienna all the navigable means that had been collected in the arm of the Danube, which encircles the Prater. We had only one company of pontoniers, whilst 6 companies were wanting for such service. All these means were brought together, as well as that of the troops on the riverside at some 100 toises above the village of Ebersdorf, which stands at the distance of about 2 leagues below Vienna. It was almost dark. We could not at least be discovered from the hostile bank when the emperor himself gave orders for embarking the first battalions, which were intended to take up a position on the left bank. He attended personally to the placing of the soldiers in the boats, where he so arranged them as to make the boats contain the greater possible number. He caused cartridges to be distributed and spoke to almost every man. He set in the rear of this convoy a boat prepared for receiving 2 pieces of cannon, which he caused to be embarked in it without their caissons, but with a quantity of grape shot and other charges sufficient for the undertaking which he meditated. The convoy left the right bank of the Danube at nightfall on the 19th May and landed on the left bank at a large island called Lobau, which had been reconnoitered beforehand and was found adapted to the contemplated object. It is exactly facing the village of Ebersdorf on the right bank. It is of considerable extent and was then so covered with wood as to present the appearance of a forest. The island is intersected in its greatest length by 2 small arms of the Danube, which may each be 18 or 20 feet broad. When the Danube is very low, the water runs through them in a small stream, fordable in all directions, even for children. But from one day to another, they become again small rivers. Next after those two arms is the branch which finally cuts off the island of Lobau from the left bank. It is as broad as the Moselle is in France. It's extremely rapid and without any ford. The Austrians had a strong detachment posted on the island and relieved it every day by means of a boat placed in front of the small towns of Joiserdorf on the left bank, to which the island afforded its pasturage. This post had only 2 or 3 sentinels on the bank of the large stream, and was itself stationed in a hut called the Lodge of the Gamekeeper, who preserved the pheasants, which were in great abundance over the island. The emperor ordered me to be present at the first landing and to return in the night to inform him of the manner in which it might have been effected. I placed myself in a small skiff rowed by 2 pontonniers and reached the hostile shore with the whole convoy. The sentinels gave the alarm, but no resistance was offered to us, and the whole night was employed in passing fresh troops over to the island of Lobau, whilst the artillery officers were engaged in superintending the construction of a bridge. The latter was intended to be of immense length and divided into 2 parts in consequence of a small sandbank, which arose out of the middle of the river, but the joint length of the 2 bridges was not less than 240 toises. The whole of the 20th May was taken up in finishing the bridge, during which time the emperor never left the bank and superintended in person the uninterrupted passage of troops in boats whilst the bridges were being completed. On the morning of the 20th, news was brought to the emperor that the enemy had effected a landing above Vienna at a village called Nursdorf, which is, properly speaking, one of the suburbs of the city, from its great proximity to it. He was not apprehensive of any important event resulting from that landing, because the troops which were on their way from St. Pölten to Vienna in order to be present when the Austrians should attempt the passage arrived on the spot at that very moment. The movement of the enemy was therefore unattended with any consequence and merely gave us 2 hours' uneasiness. The emperor was so careful never to leave anything behind him which might complicate his operation that he profited of the delay occasioned by the construction of the bridge to send me to Nursdorf with a brigade of cuirassiers in order to set his mind at ease as to the result of the landing of the enemy, whom I found to have returned to the left bank. All I had to do, therefore, was to go forward and immediately turn back to join the army. On the 21st, the bridges were entirely completed, notwithstanding the great difficulties we had to contend with owing to the absence of the principal materials for constructing them, since, to adduce one example, as a substitute for anchors, we were compelled to use heavy weights, such as Austrian pieces of cannon, which were secured to the extremities of cables, but as those weights fell upon a gravel bottom, they did not sink deep enough to resist the power of the current, so that the boats could not be prevented from floating down in spite of every attempt to secure them firmly to the spot. The officers of artillery employed in constructing this bridge really performed wonders in enabling the army to pass over it. The army filed off across the bridge in the afternoon of the 20th, and during the whole of the 21st of May, and a bridge was thrown over the last arm of the Danube by means of the Austrian pontoons, which fell into our hands at Landshut. They were convoyed upon carts and could be transported in any direction under cover of a wood full of briars, which lined the side of the river to a considerable extent. The army debouched to the left bank between the villages of Essing and Aspern. Though somewhat near the latter village, we occupied them as a defensive position by taking advantage of the walled enclosures, gardens, and burying grounds. The troops, according as they debouched, gave extension to their line by spreading themselves upon the advanced ground. Chapter 9. The corps of Marshal Massena had already passed over us, as well as 2 divisions of cuirassiers, when the Austrians, who occupied a position at no greater distance, marched down to attack us. Ever since the 19th, or at least since the 20th, which was the preceding day, they must have been aware of the point at which we should effect a passage. Accordingly, they had found time to collect their army and to advance upon us. They did not, however, evince much ardor in the charge, and I am of opinion that if we had not attempted to extend ourselves too far that night, they would not have attacked us, and we should have avoided an unsatisfactory encounter, which was attended with a loss, the effect of which was severely felt on the following day. The sun was setting when the army debouched from the space between the villages of Essling and Aspern. It had not advanced 100 toises in that immense plain when a furring fire of cannon was opened upon it in all directions. An attempt was made to silence that tremendous cannonade by a desperate charge of cavalry. This had the effect of clearing the way for us on the right, but our left was thrown back upon the village of Aspern, one half of which was occupied by the enemy, who baffled all our attempts to dislodge them. Night put an end to the action, which occasioned us very severe loss, not less than 5,000 or 6,000 men in killed and wounded, besides the immense quantity of ammunition consumed. We passed the night within musket shot of the Austrians, and the sentinels were on some points at no more than 30 paces from each other. In such a position, it was almost impossible for either army to make a movement without the other being immediately apprised of it, or rather so, as there was no obstruction intervening between them, and they both stood upon the same ground. The emperor came to bivouac that night on the sand close to the Danube, which he did not again recross. He was thus within 300 toises of the Austrian army. The whole night was taken up in passing the troops from the right to the left bank. This movement was going on at a slow rate owing to the accidents which were constantly happening to the bridge. And it was only by unremitting care and labor that the whole corps of Marshal Oudinot and Land, together with the foot guards and some reserves, could reach the left bank. The army was all night in motion in order to be prepared against an attack which it was apprehended the enemy would make at daybreak on the following morning, the 22nd of May. It was in daylight at 2 or 3 o'clock, at which hour the emperor was already on horseback and going through the ranks of his army. As often as he appeared, his presence was hailed with deafening cries of "Long live the emperor!" And as we were at pistol-shot distance from the hostile army, the latter took up arms and commenced firing a few shots through the fog which concealed us from each other, and which prevails all seasons long along the borders of the Danube. One of those shot killed the horse of General Montyon in the group about the emperor's person. The general officers urged the emperor to allow them to commence the attack in order, as they said, to take advantage of the first ardor of the soldiers. He was rather averse to the proposal, as he expected the corps of Marshal Davout, which was still on the other side of the Danube, as well as General Nansoudy's division of cuirassiers with the major part of the horse guards and many of the allied troops, but he was so warmly urged by his officers that he gave way and permitted the movements of attack to commence at the order of 3:30 in the morning. Marshal Massena debouched on the left by the village of Aspern. He had under his orders the divisions of General Molitor, Legrand, and Cara-Saint-Cyr, and the reserve division commanded by General Dimont. Marshal Land debouched on the right of Marshal Massena between Aspern and Essling, having with him the divisions of General Saint-Hilaire and Oudinot and General Boudet's division as a reserve. Behind these troops, and in second line, were the foot guards, consisting of 2 regiments of fusiliers, 2 regiments of riflemen, and 2 regiments of the old guard, that is to say, one of grenadiers and the other chasseurs. Our cavalry consisted of a brigade of light horse under the orders of General Maroulaz, 2 others under General Lasalle, the division of cuirassiers, hitherto commanded by General L'Espagne, who was killed on the preceding day, and General Saint-Sulpice's division with some squadrons of the guard composed of Poles, chasseurs, and dragoons. Marshal Davout was on the right bank, ready to cross over with the division of General Friant and those of General Morin and Gudin, which again formed part of his corps of troops. He had also under his orders General Van Damme and the Württembergers, Nansoudy's division, and the remainder of the horse guards. The Bavarians had been sent to the Tyrol to attack the insurgents and to protect the city of Munich. General Veretta's divisions, if I recollect rightly, was in the direction of Linz. The emperor had a great partiality for that officer and never parted from him but in a case of absolute necessity. Our left and center marched forward in the order already mentioned, always keeping an eye to our right, where our cavalry was stationed, I accompanied Marshal Lannes, who remained with General St. Hilaire's division. As we were traversing an immense plain, all the troops advanced in close order, partly formed in squares and partly in columns. The cannonade began almost at the very moment of our advance, and it made the greater havoc amongst us, as besides our proximity to the enemy, we presented heavy masses to their artillery. The Austrians were also formed in squares checkerwise and opened a fire of musketry upon us, but we suffered less from it than if some of their battalions had deployed. In like manner, we should have done them as much greater injury. Instead of troops consisting of raw levies, we had opposed to them such soldiers as those of the camp of Boulogne, which we might easily have moved in any direction and made to deploy under the enemy's fire without any danger of their being thrown into disorder. We were still persisting in our attempts to penetrate through that checkered line when the fire of grape shot and of musketry threw our columns into confusion and compelled us to stop and open a fire of cannonade and musketry with the disadvantages of numbers against us. This disadvantage increased the longer we remained in our present position. It was therefore natural to conclude that the engagement, so far from ending in our favor, would in all probability terminate fatally for us. We attempted to counteract the difficulties we had to contend with by ordering the cuirassiers to charge successively in several directions, but they had scarcely penetrated the Austrian line of infantry when they were driven back and closely pursued by their cavalry, which was 3 times more numerous than our own. To add our distress, the want of ammunition was generally felt about 8:30 in the morning. Officers were seen crossing the field of battle in every direction at that hour in search of the Park of Stuarts, which was still on the other side of the Danube. We were also in want of French troops, and were expecting with the utmost impatience the Corps Marshal Davout, when some officers who had been sent to accelerate his advance brought back the information that the great bridge of the Danube had been broken down. The enemy, after driving us back on the preceding day, had taken up on the bank of the river position from whence they had a complete view of our bridge in its whole extent. They contriving to fill it with stones, the largest boats they could find. They sent them down the current. This contrivance proved but too successful, since of the 2 bridges we had constructed, the one was wholly carried away and the other half destroyed. The scanty supply of boats and pontonniers had prevented our raising a stockade to protect the bridge, and an omission which proved fatal to us. This disaster soon became known to the troops that were engaged, made them lose all hope of assistance, and the several corps withdrew in succession from the contest. It could not, in fact, be expected that in the absence of all ammunition they should remain in a position where certain destruction awaited them. The Emperor commanded a retreat and superintended it himself by remaining exposed to a cannonade which we no longer answered. It became more and more harassing. As we approached the bridge, they communicated with the island Lobau and formed the center of a circle, the circumference of which was occupied by the artillery. Our left and center disputed every inch of ground in their retreat, and had not yet returned to the position between the villages of Essling and Aspirant, from whence they had debouched in the morning, when the enemy made a desperate attack upon our right and carried the village of Essling, which was defended by Boudet's division. The retreat could only be secured by our quickly regaining that position, from whence the enemy would have reached the bridge long before the arrival of Marshals Massena and Lannes to cover it. Our situation was most critical, and we were about to be thrown into complete disorder when the Emperor directed General Mouton, his aide-de-camp, to attack immediately with the Fusilier Brigade belonging to the Guards. General Mouton, who had correctly estimated the importance of succeeding in his movement, lost not a moment in placing himself at the head of the Fusiliers and entering the village of Essling in charging time, regardless of the numbers opposed to him, carried and retained possession of that village until he received orders to evacuate it. This bold and successful charge afforded us the means of effecting our retreat, but the gallant General Mouton was severely wounded and compelled to quit the field of battle. Marshal Lannes, having returned to the position he had quitted in the morning for the purpose of attacking the enemy, used his utmost endeavors to preserve it, and dismounted owing to the proximity of fire of the enemy's artillery, which made it hazardous to remain on horseback. The cavalry had crossed over long before and was stationed in the island of Lobau. The emperor himself had quitted the field of battle after issuing his final orders in respect to recrossing the bridge, and he was engaged in pointing some artillery in the island of Lobau for the purpose of protecting the retreat of our columns, when intelligence was brought to him that Marshal Lannes had just had his legs carried off by a cannon shot. He was affected to tears at this news, and at the moment he was listening to the particulars of that sad event, he perceived a litter coming from the field of battle with Marshal Lannes stretched upon it. He ordered them to be carried to a retired spot where he might be alone and uninterrupted. With his face bathed in tears, he approached and embraced his dying friend. Exhausted by the great loss of blood, Marshal Lannes said to him in broken accents, "Farewell, sire. Spare a life dear to all, and bestow a passing thought upon the memory of one of your best friends, who in 2 hours will be no more." This deeply affecting scene created in the emperor a powerful emotion. General Saint-Hilaire had a short time before been brought back wounded in the foot by a cannonball. He died of the wound a fortnight afterwards. The loss of Marshal Lannes was felt by the whole army and completed the disasters of that fatal day. The enemy did not take advantage of our retreat, but left us unmolested the whole evening in our position between Asperg and Essling. It was 5 o'clock before we retired to the wood bordering the river, which we recrossed in the night without further annoyance. The bridge of boats on the arm of the river was taken to pieces, and the pontoons which had formed it were placed upon carts, as well as the anchors, cordage beams, and thick planks, all of which were sent to the bridge on the broad arm of the Danube, where they were made to replace the boats carried away by the current. The whole army, infantry, cavalry, artillery, the staff, the wounded, everything without exception was removed to the island of Lobau on the morning of the 24th. The emperor was still in there in person on the 22nd at nightfall. He came close up to the great arm, the bridge of which had been destroyed. The waters of the Danube had greatly increased, this being the season of the melting of the snow coming from the Tyrol. So even the 2 arms which traversed the island and had hitherto been found dry, or at least fordable, had become dangerous torrents, requiring hanging bridges to be thrown over them. The emperor crossed them in a skiff, having the Prince of Neuchâtel and myself in his company. We were unable to bring our horses over and were under the necessity of continuing our journey on foot. When arrived on the bank of the Danube, the emperor sat down under a tree and there waited for Marshal Massena, to whom he had sent orders to join him. He soon came up to us, and the emperor formed a small council in order to collect the opinions of those about him as to what had best be done under existing circumstances. Let the reader picture to himself the emperor sitting between Massena and Berthier on the bank of the Danube, with a bridge in front, of which there scarcely remained any vestige. Marshal Davout's corps on the other side of the broad river, and behind the island of Lobau itself, the whole army separated from the enemy by a mere arm of the Danube, 30 or 40 toises as broad, and deprived of all means of extricating itself from this position. And he will admit that the lofty and powerful mind of the emperor could alone be proof against discouragement. He was fully prepared for the suggestion about to be offered to him of recrossing the Danube in the best manner possible, and of leaving behind what could not be removed, such as the whole of the artillery, the horses, etc. The emperor quietly listened to all the arguments urged upon his attention and said, "You might as well, gentlemen, advised me to retreat to Strasbourg. If I recross the Danube, I must evacuate Vienna, because the enemy will cross over immediately after me. May they not then drive me back to Strasbourg? In my present condition, I have no means of resisting their attack except by endeavoring to cross to the left bank of the river if they should cross over to its right bank, and thus to maneuver round Vienna, which is really my capital and the center of my resources. If I recross the Danube and the Archduke should also cross it at Linz, for example, I shall have to march upon Linz, whereas by remaining in the position I now occupy, if he attempts that movement, I shall cross over and follow him until he turns round upon me. It is impossible I should remove to any distance from Vienna without leaving behind me 20,000 men, one half of whom will otherwise have returned to their ranks before the expiration of a month from the present time." He brought everyone back to his opinion, and although the prospect of reposing from our fatigues on the other side of the Danube would have been cheering to everyone, we resigned ourselves to the necessity of remaining on the island. Marshal Massena assumed the command of all the troops which were concentrated there, and the emperor gave him written instructions regarding the mode of defense he was to adopt, if there was reason to apprehend that he should resist an attack. Chapter 10. After having adopted this determination, the emperor ordered the engineers and sappers who were in the island to embark in the boats which had been saved from the broken bridge and return to the right bank, and he got into a skiff with Prince de Neuchâtel and myself for the same destination. We crossed the Danube toward midnight. The emperor was exhausted with fatigue, and I offered him the assistance of my arm to walk up to the house which he had occupied in the village of Ebersdorf previously to the passing of the river. His mind was evidently at work, though free from agitation. On arriving, he had laid himself down on a bundle of straw and took a few moments' rest. 2 hours after daylight, he was already on horseback and visiting the bivouacs of those troops, owing to the breaking down of the bridge, had been prevented from taking a part in the engagement. Malevolence has delighted in representing the emperor as of a mistrustful character, and yet on this occasion, where ill-intentioned men might have made any attempt upon his person, his only guard at headquarters was the Portuguese Legion, which watched as carefully over him as the veterans of the army of Italy would have done. The first object of attention was to collect a few boats in order to send provisions to the island of Lobau, and the exertions to supply the army were attended with success. Every endeavor was made to send boats with the rigging down the currents from all parts of the Danube for the purpose of constructing fresh bridges, and our efforts were not unavailing. The bridges were already restored, and the cavalry about to cross when the Austrians again contrived to send boats loaded with stones down the stream, which broke them a second time. This fortunately occurred in the open day, and we were therefore enabled on our parts to send some skiffs after them, whose descent being much more rapid than the fragments of the bridge, the latter were secured and brought to the left bank, from whence by dint of considerable exertions they were led back to the bridges. This painful labor would not have been attended with any successful result had we not been joined by the corps of 1,200 sailors from Antwerp, who were commanded by naval officers. This corps was followed by a battalion of artisans of every trade, and also belonging to the naval department, and we were saved by their timely assistance. The sailors were immediately united to the pontonniers, and a quantity of little skiffs manned by a proportionate number of sailors were kept up as cruisers on the river. These skiffs kept close to the sandbanks, bordering the island scattered over the Danube, but as soon as they descried a boat or raft coming down, they rowed up to it and instantly boarded and brought it to the riverside, so that the very boats which had destroyed our bridges on the preceding day afforded us on the next means of repairing them. From thenceforth they escaped all danger of being broken down, and we were enabled to send over to the right bank the cavalry, the artillery, and whatever we could dispense with. The horses had lived upon the grass and leaves found on the island ever since the day of the engagement. It was no small advantage to have restored the bridges and secured them from further accident by means of the skiffs manned by regular sailors and formed into a stockade to protect them. The emperor sent the troops to the cantonment they had occupied previously to this disastrous operation, and left only Marshal Massena and his corps in the island. He was at a loss to account for the Austrians having neglected to bring all their artillery down to the banks of that arm of the Danube which separated them from the island, and keep up a constant firing of cannon, every shot of which would have told, added to which they could have done us more harm, as we had no ammunition to return the fire, and we were in dense masses upon the island. We augured from the circumstances that they contemplated to cross the river at some point above Vienna. The emperor disposed his army in such a manner as to be able to bring it together within 24 hours. He kept up with them all the infantry that had recrossed from the island to the right bank and made it go into camp. He attended to the reorganization of the artillery and named on this occasion General Lariboisiere, first inspector of that bridge of service in lieu of General Saint-Gilles, who had been mortally wounded. Measures were also adopted for procuring remounts for the cavalry. All the disorders which he had to issue on this subject were expedited in one night, and he considered the next morning of the means of preparing anew the materials requisite for a fresh passage across, which he expressed his determination to effect in the course of 1 month from the present time. On the former occasion, he had only thrown one bridge over the arm of the Danube that separated him from the enemy, and he now resolved to build 4, though he had not one of the boats which are indispensable for the construction of the 3 additional ones. He established in the island of Lobau the battalion of naval officers with the shipwrights of the same corps who had arrived with them and sent thither from Vienna timber of every dimension and quality in a very few days. The keels were laid of all the boats he stood in need of, and the boats were soon launched in one of the small arms running through the island. This work was very creditable to the shipwrights of the Naval Department. Whilst these pontoons were preparing in the island of Lobau, the emperor was causing a bridge upon piles to be constructed, which extended the whole width of the Danube. General Bertrand, his aide-de-camp, was the officer who executed this splendid work. Bertrand was one of the best engineer officers that France could boast of since the days of Vauban. He established himself on the riverside with all the artillery officers and the battalions of sappers. The exhaustless arsenal of Vienna had supplied us with a profusion of timber originally destined for repairing the bridges of Vienna and of Krems, and also with cordage and iron, and with 40 engines to drive the piles in. All this was brought down to Ebersdorf and the environs of that village, transformed into docks, not unlike those of an extensive seaport. The driving in of the piles, the sawing of wooden boards, and the building of boats all went on at the same time, whilst every means were preparing to cross the river. Attention was paid to defending the island of Lobau, an object which was also to afford the means of protecting the passage to the left bank. Epaulements and embrasures were raised along the arm of the Danube and lined with Austrian artillery, taken from the arsenal of Vienna, of which General Lariboisiere had collected all the workmen, whose condition being extremely wretched, they had consented to assist in the labor for the sake of the soldiers' ration. This part of the military administration performed wonders and set on foot an immense number of guns of all sizes. The activity displayed in raising resources would almost appear incredible to those who witnessed it. Still less justice can be done to it by any description which, however correct, would not escape the charge of being deemed exaggerated. Whilst the emperor was urging on the works at the arsenals and in the docks, he bent his mind to recomposing the personnel of his army so effectually that it should no longer be exposed to the consequence of any fatal engagement like that of the 22nd of May, nor even of any doubtful one. The ideas to which his inventive genius gave birth, the obstacles which his mind had to overcome, exceeded all belief. He first sent orders to the viceroy, who commanded the army of Italy, consisting of 4 complete divisions, to bring it over without the smallest delay. In order which was punctually obeyed, he also sent word to General Marmont, who commanded in Dalmatia, to come and join him immediately. This general had 2 divisions under his orders and could only reach Vienna after surmounting many and serious difficulties. The disaster of Essling had been carefully made known in every direction by the agents of Austria, who neglected none of the means best calculated to keep up the hopes of the subjects of that monarchy. so that General Marmont, when he penetrated through those provinces, was everywhere obstructed by insurrections or by the ill will of the inhabitants. Nothing short of a feeling much more powerful than the mere love of duty could have enabled him to conquer all these obstacles and to bring up a well-conditioned body of veterans. This service was duly appreciated by the emperor, who was partial to Marmont, and was glad of an opportunity of expressing his satisfaction at what he had done. At the commencement of the campaign, he had sent French marshals or generals to command the contingents of the several confederated princes, as had been agreed upon by common consent, without any derogation from the authority vested in the generals of those princes, who had the control over whatever related to military details and to the discipline of the troops. He had placed his own generals at the head of those contingents for no other reason than that they were more accustomed to his manner of enforcing obedience, and that they should correspond with the Prince of Neuchâtel according to the practice of the other French officers. Marshal Bernadotte had accordingly been sent to take command of the Saxon army, consisting of 2 fine divisions of infantry and 1 of cavalry. The Saxon corps covered Dresden, previously to the Archduke Charles's army being joined by the Austrian forces in Bohemia. But from the moment of their junction and of Saxony having no longer any attack to apprehend, except from a few partisans who made occasional inroads into that country, the emperor had recalled that Saxon corps, which was the last to join him in consequence of the circuit it had to make. He likewise urged the King of Bavaria to make some further efforts of a more decisive character than heretofore against the Tyrolese insurgents, so as to enable him to withdraw a Bavarian division to his assistance in case of need. All necessary orders for reframing the personnel of his army were both given and dispatched on the first days following the 22nd of May. Nothing more remained to be done except to attend to the comfort of the troops he had with him and prevent their numbers from becoming imperceptibly reduced, as it usually happens in war under trying and difficult circumstances. His attention was particularly directed to the hospitals, and he had them regularly visited by his aides-de-camp. After the battle, he made them the bearers of a gratuity of 60 francs in crown pieces to each wounded soldier, and from 150 to 1,500 francs to the officers according to their respective ranks. He sent still larger sums to the wounded generals. The emperor's aides-de-camp had for several days no other occupation to attend to. I can assert, as far as concerned myself, that I was constantly engaged during 48 hours in making the distributions to 3 of the hospitals. The emperor had given orders that this should be done in the manner most calculated to soothe the feelings of the wounded. The visits to the hospitals, for example, were made by the aide-de-camp in full uniform, accompanied by the war commissary, the officers of health, and the director. The secretary of the hospital went before them with the register of the sick in hand, and named the men as well as the regiment to which they belonged. After which 12 5-franc pieces were placed at the head of the bed of each wounded soldier, this sum being taken out of the baskets full of money carried by 4 men dressed in the emperor's livery. These gratuities were not drawn from the military chest, but entirely supplied out of the emperor's private purse. A collection might have been made no less valuable as materials for the emperor's history than as redundant to his glory, of the many expressions of gratitude uttered by these gallant fellows, as well as of the language in which they gave vent to their love and attachment to his person. Some of the men could not hope to spend those 12 crown pieces, but at the very brink of death, the tears running down their cheeks strongly indicated how feelingly alive they were to this mark of their general's remembrance. At no time did I feel so enthusiastic in admiration for the emperor as when he was attending to the wants of his soldiers. His heart expanded in hearing of any service rendered to them, or of his being the object of their affection. He has been accused of having been unsparing of their lives, but they never encountered any danger without having him at their head. He was everything at once, and nothing but the basest malevolence can calumniate the sentiment which was nearest his heart, and which is one of the numberless claims which his immense labors have given him to the homage of posterity. he was beloved by the soldiers, and he loved them in return. It is impossible they could have for him a greater attachment than what he entertained for them. He passed the month of June in unceasing occupations and had not removed from Ebersdorf, where he proposed to remain until the moment of passing the Danube, when other business suddenly called him away and compelled him to transfer his headquarters to Schönbrunn, his stay at Ebersdorf having been wholly occasioned by the conviction he felt that the enemy would not remain inactive. He was therefore desirous of being in readiness to avail himself of any chance that fortune might place within his grasp. Chapter 11. The Battle of Essling appeared to have been thrown the whole of Germany into convulsion. The people of Prussia in particular were on the point of breaking out into open acts, and had they not considered a second success on the part of the Austrians as a matter of course, nothing could have withheld them. But they paused to take a surer aim. The state of public opinion was such that a Colonel Schill, belonging to a regiment of hussars, had the courage to quit his garrison at the head of his regiment to engage in a wandering and partisan warfare in countries free from French corps. The King of Prussia disavowed this colonel's conduct, but there is ground for believing that if Colonel Schill had not been aware of the inward sentiments of his sovereign and of the nation, he would not have dared to act as he did, and again hazard the safety of the Prussian monarchy. Some Westphalian troops were sent in pursuit of him, and he was killed near Stralsund. The moral effect of our disaster had been decidedly against us. The German authorities had no sooner issued an order all over the country forbidding the introduction of supplies into Vienna than they were immediately obeyed. Nothing was heard of but insurrections in the countries which our troops evacuated for the purpose of swelling our ranks. Our position in Vienna became extremely critical as soon as the cries of want began to generally be heard. The bakers had no bread to deal out to the groups of people who had collected round their shops, and in such numbers that it was found necessary to station guards for their protection. The emperor was seen at this time riding about the suburbs and exerting himself with the chief commissary of the army to restore abundance to Vienna with the same zeal as if the population of Paris had been the object of his solicitude. And yet, what had he to apprehend for his troops? The military stores were full, and if the mob of Vienna had attempted to revolt, it had assuredly no claim to his consideration. Really, he would sometimes exclaim, the Emperor of Austria would do much more for his fame by recrossing the Danube and rescuing his capital than by starving his subjects to death and imposing upon me the task of preserving them from the evils to which his hatred for my person has subjected them. It is important to mention that in this painful crisis, the magistrates of Vienna came to solicit the emperor's permission for their sending a deputation to the Emperor of Austria, whom they were desirous of prevailing upon to issue orders that the supplies of which his subjects in Vienna stood in need should be allowed to pass in the Danube and through the frontiers of Hungary. The emperor granted their request and had them conducted to the advanced posts. They accordingly proceeded to the headquarters of their sovereign. But whether the prince fancied it to be a stratagem on our part to obtain supplies, or whether he had any other motive for not conceding to the deputation, all they came to request, they had the mortification to return without gaining their object. It was only some time later that the Emperor of Austria granted full latitude in this respect, and we ascertained that he only did so upon learning that we were not mainly interested in that act of humanity,